Okay, so today we are talking about species and speciation. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of what a species is, because I know we haven't gotten to ecology yet. But it is important here, and we're going to talk about speciation, which is the process of forming a new species due to the process of natural selection. So, before I get started, does anyone have any questions? So, starting us off, we are going to talk about the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolution is the stuff that we've been talking about with like Hardy Weinberg, right? It's the changes in allele frequencies in a population. So when we're looking at just one population and how that population has evolved over time, that is what biologists call microevolution. And then we get into when we start talking about how populations evolve together. So how one population can influence another population. Um, if you remember stuff like coevolution and evolutionary arms races um, and stuff like that, those are all macroevolutionary patterns. And then finally, speciation is what uh, kind of creates the link between micro and macro evolution, right? Speciation is the formation of a new species. It will help us get from the allele frequencies in one population to how the allele frequencies in two populations can influence one another. So we've got microevolution is in one population, macroevolution is above the species level, and speciation helps us form an in between. So micro is one population, macro is more than one species, and speciation is the link between the two. That's where we're on. So before we get into any of the specific things that lead to speciation, we need the definition of a species. If you remember the definition from species of a species from ecology in Bio 1, it is the exact same definition, right? It is a group of populations um, of the same species that have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce fertile offspring. So you have to be able to produce fertile, viable offspring in a mating situation in order for you to be considered part of the same species. And speciation is the process by which one species splits into two or more species. So, um, when two groups of what was one original species can no longer interbreed, that is when we get speciation. Let me know if you want the shorthand underline thing. I can do that as well. Yeah. Okay. That I can do. So, whole population or group of populations that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That is a species. And speciation is where we have one species splitting into two or more species over time. It's not like an instantaneous thing. It takes some time and some selective pressures coming one way or the other. So, let's see. The formation of a new species depends on reproductive isolation, right? If our definition of a species means or has to do with being able to reproduce and have fertile offspring, we need reproductive isolation, which is the existence of barriers that impede members of two species from interbreeding and producing fertile, viable offspring. So, reproductive isolation is the existence of barriers that impede two species from interbreeding. And there are a lot of these barriers that can create reproductive isolation. So, when two groups of two populations are reproductively isolated, they can become two different species, or they are two different species. These barriers block gene flow and limit the formation of hybrids or offspring from interspecific mating. Offspring from interspecific mating. Cutting out the prepositional phrases and all of that. So we've got in order to form a new species, they have to be reproductively isolated, right? They can't have fertile, viable offspring. These barriers limit the formation of hybrids. So hybrids are like a organism produced from two individuals of a different species mating. And block gene flow between species. So if there's an allele that was in the population and only one of the species got, it can't necessarily flow into the other species because they can no longer interbreed. So that allele is now with one species and not the other. So in order for reproductive isolation to happen, there are a couple different mechanisms. There are prezygotic and postzygotic mechanisms. So prezygotic happens before we make a zygote, so before the process of fertilization. Postzygotic happens after fertilization. So reproductive isolation can happen before or after. We're going to talk specifically about these different types. So there are 5 prezygotic barriers to reproduction. These 5 will also be the slide titles for the next 5 slides. So if you don't get all of these done, that's fine. But we are going to get the prezygotic barriers to reproduction first, and then we will move on to postzygotic barriers. Some of these you may have heard before. Some of these you may have interacted with before. Some of these may be brand new. It's just kind of the luck of the draw. So starting us off with habitat isolation. So habitats are different than ecosystems, right? So if a species of bird lives on the bottom of a forest and another species of bird lives kind of in the trees in that same forest, they're in the same area, right? They could interact, but habitat, so two species in different habitats in the same area may encounter each other rarely, so rare encounters, and they're not separated by physical barriers, but they are still separated. So it's not like there's a river between two. It's not like there's a population on either side of the river, right? It's just that some birds like to live on the 4th floor, and some of them like to live up in the canopy. They're not separated by anything. They just have different habitats. Let's see. The example your book gives is the two fly species right? Very, very closely related fly species. One of them only lays their eggs in blueberries, and one of them only lays their eggs in apples. So they're in the same area. They just chose different habitats to reproduce in and eventually became reproductively isolated. And as they became reproductively isolated, they eventually evolved into two different species. So they had different selective pressures. Maybe something allows one of these fly species to penetrate an apple and the other one lets them penetrate blueberries. And over time, those differences became so different that they became different species. Another one is temporal isolation. So species that reproduce at different times, whether it's days, weeks, months, or years. Do the little friends clap, right? Species that breed during different times can't mix their gametes, right? One of the common temporal isolation things are cicadas, right? There are some cicadas that come out of the ground every 3 years. There are some cicadas that come out of the ground every 17 years, like the ones that should be coming this May, right? If you haven't heard of the big cicada cycle, the first time they came around, I believe I was like 8 years old. So you all might have been like toddlers. They are coming back this year, or they're supposed to come back this year. So if two species of cicada, one that comes out every 10 years and one that comes out every 3 years, right? They're rarely, if ever, going to emerge on the same day or within the same season. Same thing with some flowers only open up at night and some flowers only open up in the day. So if these two flowers open up at different times during the day, they can't be pollinated with one another because they're not open at the same time. So that is temporal isolation, where we've got different times of the day, week, month, year, stuff like that. Questions about these? All right, another one is behavioral isolations. So, courtship rituals that are unique to a species are reproductive barriers, right? Even in closely related species. If there are two groups of birds and one of them prefers an elaborate mating dance and one prefers coloration, right? Then the birds with the fancy colors and the birds that prefer the fancy colors would kind of form their own little subgroup, and the birds that perform fancy mating dances and the birds that perform the fancy mating dances would eventually form two different like subgroups, and over time sexual selection will produce birds with increased coloration and fancy feathers on one side and more complicated mating dances on the other side, until eventually you have two different populations that are reproductively isolated, where one species or one group will not mate with a member of the other group because their behavior doesn't necessarily match up. So this is most common in intersexual sexual selection mechanisms, where it is more female choice than it is members of the same sex fighting it out, right? So this is where one member chooses a member of the other sex, and that choice could lead to isolation. So the other one is mechanical isolation. So their parts don't match, right? If they can't actively do, right? They can't have babies. There's no way fertilization is going to happen if they don't fit. So, if a group of populations over time, let's see, what is the so the example the book gives is that shells of two species of snails spiral in different directions. Some of them spiral to the left and some of them spiral to the right. And then this leads to the snail's genitals not being able to what's the word they use? They're not aligned correctly, therefore they cannot carry out any sort of mating compatibility. So something physical happens that prevents mating from occurring. So that is mechanical isolation. If that happens eventually, with that, right, the right-handed snails and the left-handed snails, or right-shelled and left-shelled snails, they eventually are so separated that they become two different species. That's mechanical isolation. I believe this is the last prezygotic, and that is gamete isolation. So this is where the sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another. Whoop. Goodness gracious. Just this first sentence. So this could happen from a number of reasons. If the sperm cells are not able to survive the trip through the reproductive tract, right? If a group of a population just have not so great sperm mobility, or if they have a specifically treacherous reproductive tract, then the sperm cannot get to the eggs. Or certain biochemical stuff prevents it from breaking membranes. The act of fertilization actually has a lot of really cool biochemistry in it that unfortunately we couldn't get into with development without wasting too much time. But it's a really, really cool mechanism that involves a lot of reactions. And if those sperm cells can't carry out those reactions, or the egg cells don't respond with the appropriate reactions, fertilization can't take place. So with our prezygotic stuff, right? It's either time, space, mechanical isolation, so or gametic isolation. Behavioral isolation was one I forgot. So these are all of our prezygotic, so pre-fertilization, reproductive isolation mechanisms. Any questions? Okay. All right, I know it's a lot. So then we have the post-zygotic barriers. There are only 3 of them, so a little less, because it is rarer that fertilization happen in these scenarios. Number 1 is reduced hybrid viability. Another one is reduced hybrid fertility. And finally, there is hybrid breakdown. So starting us off, this is only one sentence, so this is what we got. If the genes of one species interact in a way that impair the hybrid's development or its survival in the environment, then we have reduced hybrid viability. So the 2 species can have a baby, but that baby either will not develop or will not survive very long. The example here is salamander subspecies, right? A bunch of subspecies of salamanders. If 2 of those subspecies try to reproduce, either the salamander eggs will not develop properly, or the salamanders that do come out of those eggs are really frail and do not survive very long in the wild. So if 2 species have or 2 individuals have a offspring, then that offspring may or may not be able to survive in the wild. And that's kind of one of the first, like, oh, maybe speciation is happening here. Because prezygotic and postzygotic scenarios can happen at the same time, right? There can be more than one of these happening at once. So in addition to reduced hybrid viability, we also have reduced hybrid fertility. This is if, because I can't spell or type, I guess. So even if hybrids are viable and vigorous, right, they may be sterile. So we only need this first sentence. This could be because the chromosomes of the two parent populations differ in number or structure. So if the chromosomes don't line up correctly, or don't match up right, then meiosis can't take place to make gametes in the offspring. And if the gamete can't have babies, then it is not considered a species. We hear about this one a lot because of donkeys, horses, and mules, right? If a male donkey and a female horse have offspring, that is considered a mule. Mules are always infertile or sterile. Same thing with a female donkey and a male horse, also sterile. So, compatible enough to create an organism that is functional and useful to humans, right? We use mules, or had in the past. But you can't like take two mules and make more mules. You have to make mules with horses and or donkeys, yes. So that is reduced hybrid fertility. Because in order to be considered a species, right, you have to be, or two different species, you have to be able to produce fertile offspring in order to be considered the same species. Sorry. Yeah, so that proves because donkeys aren't fertile, right? It proves that horses and mules are two different species because they can't produce fertile offspring. And finally, with our post-zygotic thing is hybrid breakdowns. So the first generation from that hybrid could very well be vigorous and moving around. And it could even have fertility and offspring of itself. But if you cross that species with a member of the same, like another hybrid, or if you do it with the parent species, the P2 generation is not going to be viable or will not be able to reproduce. The example they give in the book is rice. So strains of rice have accumulated a lot of different recessive alleles. Hybrids between two groups with different recessive alleles will be vigorous and fertile, but plants in the next generation that carry a lot of these recessive alleles are small and sterile. So these rice strains aren't considered different species yet, but they have begun to be separated by post-zygotic barriers. So if one group has recessive allele A, right? So if one group has recessive allele A, but not recessive allele B, right? This is a group of rice, and this is a group of rice. They can have offspring if you hybridize that are both heterozygotes, but these can't produce fertile offspring. If that helps. Hybrid breakdown, right? Where you can have the hybrid with two recessive alleles, but they can't produce fertile, sterile offspring in that third generation. So this is what's happening in certain rice cultivation. So they're not yet two different species. It's just two different recessive alleles in a population. But this is like the beginning of a zygotic barrier. Okay, those are all of our reproductive isolation mechanisms. I have two more species concepts. So we have been talking about species in a biological context. Morphological species concept separates species by body shape, and structural features. Ecological species defines a species in terms of its niche. We haven't really talked about niches in this class yet. But these are also two different kind of definitions of species, though they are not used as often as our reproductive explanation, because that is the most widely accepted. So the morphological species concept distinguishes a species by body shape. So if two bodies are shaped very differently, they are considered two different species. But if they're very similar, they're considered the same species. So we don't necessarily go as far as reproductive isolation or reproductive success. And the ecological species concept defines a species in terms of its ecological niche. So if a species inherits the same or is in the same ecological niche, it is considered the same species. If two individuals are in different ecological niches, they're considered different species. So just because even in science, a lot of what you look at depends on your perspective, right? A lot of times people think, oh, science, black and white, not even close, right? We have to think about what we are bringing into an assumption or an explanation to kind of help us support our answers. So if you are defining a species by its body shape, you are not using the ecological species concept, you are using the morphological species concept. This board does not erase well. So those are just some other definitions of species I wanted to throw at you, just so you know that there are more than one perspective through which to look at this. So, kind of throwing it back to speciation rather than reproductive isolation. So reproductive isolation, oh, goodness gracious, I'm going forward, not back. Ooh, speciation happens because of reproductive isolation, but there are different ways that speciation can take place. So there are different mechanisms in which reproductive isolation can help speciation along. The first is allopatric speciation. So in allopatric speciation, goodness gracious, we have a population divided into geographically isolated populations, right? So big islands with lots of different bird populations on it. Big windstorm happens. Woo. Big windstorm happens, and it takes these insects or birds to one of two different islands. These are geographically isolated, right? There is a barrier that they cannot cross. So each of these islands will put their own selective pressures on these species to eventually, if the correct selective pressures arise, create two different species. So this is what they think happened with Charles Darwin's finches. So we've got separate gene pools with different selective pressures, so different things selecting for different traits. This is allopatric speciation. Say that 10 times fast. All right. Questions about allopatric speciation? Okay. Because the opposite of not opposite, but in contrast to allopatric speciation, we have sympatric speciation, where our organisms or our populations are in the same geographic area, but reproductive barriers still exist. So these are organisms that inhabit the same area, but gene flow is reduced by different factors. Three of the most common are polyploidy, sexual selection, and habitat differentiation. In allopatric speciation, we have to reach a couple different prereqs in order for allopatric speciation to happen. Or sympatric, goodness gracious. Sympatric speciation does not happen as often as allopatric speciation does. It is a lot harder for sympatric speciation to take place because there has to be a lot stricter isolative things. So, in sympatric speciation, we're in the same place, but things like polyploidy, sexual selection, and habitat differentiation kind of muck up the works a little bit. We have briefly talked about polyploidy before. Habitat differentiation was almost already in this slide already, and sexual selection we know can happen in a couple different ways. All right, so polyploidy, right? So if an accident, ooh, goodness gracious, that's not what I want. We're gonna erase that. I'm gonna bring a highlighter into it, right? So if an accident during cell division leads to an extra set of chromosomes, this is called polyploidy, right? Where we have more than the 2n number or n number of chromosomes. This happens in two ways. Autopolyploidy has chromosomes from a single species. So if two individuals of the same species reproduce and an organism has more than the 2n number of chromosomes, right, or more than two sets of chromosomes, that is called autopolyploidy. And allopolyploidy happens when two species create a hybrid offspring. So if an organism with 4 chromosomes and an organism with 2 chromosomes, which is very unlikely, that is a large chromosome difference, reproduce and their offspring have 3 chromosomes, and those offspring are viable, or it happens a lot, right? That is called allopolyploidy. So this is a way that new organisms can arise, that new species can arise in the same environment. So in a sympatric speciation kind of thing. If you've got different chromosomes, different DNA can lead to a different species. It is very, very unlikely that this happened in a large mammal population. Polyploidy is usually in plants. Can't read that, that says usually. So, polyploid organisms don't really exist in the mammalian kind of way, but plants have polyploid situations way more often, and therefore polyploidy is much more likely in plant populations. All right, sexual selection, right? Ooh, look, just that first sentence. So if mate choice is based on coloration, it can separate two groups, like that example I gave with the population of birds where one group prefers a mating dance while the other group prefers fancy colors, right? It's a horrible highlighting job, but anyway. Sexual selection can also be derived, or can also be a form of sympatric speciation, or a driver of sympatric speciation. We're almost there, I promise. This is a beefier lecture. So, sexual selection can drive sympatric speciation. And finally, all right, if subpopulations exploit habitats or resources not used, this is literally just the whole sentence. So if a like F1 or F2 generation realizes that they can survive better or longer if they use a different resource, live in a different place, eat something new, right? They can kind of open up a door that leads to new selective pressures, right? If a species of bird realizes that they can use their beak to chop up fruit into pieces that they can eat, right? Their next generation might be more likely to have beaks that are better at cutting open fruits as opposed to whatever they were eating before. So if we get a new habitat, or if something happens in the environment and they get a new habitat, that can lead to speciation. Whew. Almost there. So, hybrid zones. This is like an entire lesson I packed into one slide. So, a hybrid zone is a region where members of different species often mate. So, it is where if two populations of birds, right, if they are almost but not completely isolated, but there is a certain area that they do meet and reproduce in, that is called a hybrid zone. They can do a lot of different things to natural selection. We can reinforce reproductive barriers because hybrids are less fit. So if those hybrids are less fit and they don't survive, right, they're less likely to mate in the future. But barriers to reproduction also may be weak, which can slowly combine gene pools until we fuse the two species into one. So like the opposite of speciation can happen in a hybrid zone, where these birds meet up all the time, and then all of a sudden all of their babies start to look the same, and then both species just become one big species. That can happen in a hybrid zone. And if hybrid zones are super stable, hybrids can continue to be produced. So if this hybrid zone very regularly and very dependently exists, so if the mating or migration patterns of two bird species always match up, they could very well continually, that's not what I wanted, continually have hybrid offspring. I know. All right, yes, we only have one slide. We got this. So, these hybrids often aren't the most fit for their environment. They're still typically selected against. But there's not really anything to stop these two populations from interbreeding in this hybrid zone if it's super stable. So that is speciation within a hybrid zone. One last thing, one last pattern that can arrive arise out of speciation. I'll do this one down like so pretty hefty. So far, the way we've talked about evolution, right, or natural selection, we have talked about slow, gradual changes over time, right? One generation gets a little bit different, the next generation gets a little bit different, the next generation gets a little bit different. This theory of gradual change is not the only theory as to how speciation occurs. There is another one, and it is called punctuated equilibrium. So, in a punctuated equilibrium, in this theory, we have periods of stasis or really, really stable environments that are kind of punctuated or dotted with sudden bouts of change, actually. So, if we do a little chart, right? If this is time, because time is always on the x-axis, it does not like being written down here at the very, very bottom. If this is time along the x-axis, and this is the rate of evolution, if we have something really, really big that happens, like, and we're talking like geologic time, right? So, volcanic eruption, right? Volcanic eruption shoots a bunch of ash into the sky, temperatures cool, right? Environments change. Because of that sudden new environment, we are going to have some members of a population do well and some members of a population not do so well, and those effects are going to be pretty immediate. So we've got a period of really, really rapid change that slopes really, really high. And then nothing happens for a while. Pretty chill. We have a really stable environment for a while where nothing really happens. There's not a lot of evolution because they're pretty much suited for this new environment. And then boom, ice age. It gets really, really cold. So all of a sudden, the organisms that are more well adapted to that cold are going to do better really, really fast. And then things will mellow out a little bit. All right? And then all of a sudden, boom, something dramatic happens. This is punctuated equilibrium. Whereas if we were talking about gradual evolution, it would be something more like this. Where that black line is punctuated equilibrium, and that red line is our gradual change over time. Not too bad for sitting awful. So, usually when people talk about punctuated equilibrium, they talk about fossil records, right? Fossil records are like dependent on levels, like striations in sediment, right? So they're like, okay, organisms in this area are from the Jurassic period, organisms from this area are from the Triassic period, so on and so forth, right? So they don't necessarily see slow changes in fossils. They see all of a sudden, boom, we've got new fossils in this next layer that we don't have in the layer before it. That's where our punctuated equilibrium comes into play. If you wanted to visualize this, we've got our slow over time and our sudden rapid changes. Thank you. I know this was a lot. Have a wonderful day.